Okay, we're on Chaf Beis and Beis. No place for wait next. Okay, Eved Ivri because okay. So until now we spoke about Eved Ivri. Now we switched to Eved Kanani, and yeah, laws. A lot of the laws of Eved Kanani we saw already in Gittin, in the middle of the Masechta, the Lameds and the Mems. Now we talk about simpler questions. How do you get an Eved Kanani? So Eved Kanani nikne b'kesef u'b'shtar b'chazal. These are the same methods you use to acquire property. Kesef is money, shtar document, chazaka is a chazaka of the field. The field would be a chazaka. Another type of chazaka, which is also very common, is to walk the perimeter of the field, or double check the what they call it, the survey, surveying the field, make sure you got your property is correct. That also be type of chazaka. We'll soon see what type of chazaka happens by an Eved Kanani. And the answer, in a nutshell, is basically use him. Maybe we'll see some other interesting ways of acquiring an Eved Kanani. The koine is asking, how does he get himself? Okay, so listen closely. The kesef aydecherem, money if somebody else buys him. In other words, somebody else could buy his freedom, but he can't buy his freedom. I'll have to explain that. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. If using a document, then by him receiving his document, he goes free. And this is the concept we spoke about in gittin called gittin v'yali banke echad. This is a general question. How is it ever, if whatever the Eved owns, the master owns, how can he ever acquire himself? Because he's acquiring the divorce on behalf of the emancipation on behalf of his master. Because he can't acquire anything without his master. So we have a concept called gittin v'yali banke echad. Because this is the chicken and the egg problem, right? So what we say the chicken and egg came together. Right. In other words, we say that because if the divorce is going to be valid, then he actually could acquire his divorce. So say both the chicken, he acquires his freedom and the ability to acquire his freedom at the same time. Okay. We'll discuss gittin in a minute. Chaf Beis and Beis, we're at the Mishnah. We're on the third line of the Mishnah. There we are, exactly. Okay, so rabbis say kesef, if he's redeeming himself with money, himself. We'll discuss the second part completely over. It's not let's just say the simple reading of the Mishnah is entirely incorrect according to the Gemara. I'll summarize in a moment. Because of the and document through somebody else. So but other people have to give him the money. So basically, in summary, an Eved Kanani can be acquired with money, a document, or chazaka. How does he get his own freedom? We have a major debate here. The simple version of the debate, which we'll dispose of in about 15 minutes, but until we dispose of it, the machlokes is as follows. According to our mayor, if he's acquiring himself with money, somebody else has to do the acquisition. If he's using a document, he could do it. According to Chacham, it's the opposite. If it's money, he could acquire himself. If it's a document, then somebody else has to acquire his freedom on his behalf. And we'll explain that. Whatever. We'll dispense with this simple explanation shortly. Okay. Minolan, how do we know this? The Siv, the verse states, you'll inherit a slave to your children. The Rosh Sachuz as an inheritance of an estate. The Torah equates a slave with a ste'achuza, with an estate. Mas ste'achuza, a regular field, nikta b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka, is acquired with kesef shtar and chazaka. Of Eved Kanani, nikta b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka, and Eved Kanani also has the same kinyanim. Now, if you recall the beginning of Kiddushin, the first mission was how do you acquire a woman, and now the rest of the parak discusses many other different types of acquisitions. We'll get to how do you acquire an animal and how do you acquire movable items, etc. We'll learn more about that, including how to acquire property. But the three ways to acquire property is kesef, shtar, and chazaka. Okay, if that's the case, if you're equating Eved Kanani to property, ste'achuza goes back to the master and yovel. So you should say the same thing is true of an Eved Kanani. You have a Jewish family that has an Evet Kanani. They sell him to somebody else. Comes Yovel, you should have to give him back, because we're saying that a Steach Chuza, a field which goes back in Yovel, is the same like an Evet Ivri. And an Evet Ivri is the same as a Steach Chuza. So it should go back in Yovel. The Torah specifically says, with regard to an Evet Kanani, you enslave him forever. And therefore we see he does not go back at Yovel. Okay. Now we have a little bit of disagreement. Tana, there is an opinion that says, Af b'chalipin. One of the ways to acquire an Evet Ivri, an Evet Kanani, is chalipin. Are you familiar with what chalipin is? Chalipin is a kinyan. So chalipin is sort of a way to use one thing to acquire something else. So let's say you have let's say for example, you want to acquire a silo full of grain, but you don't want to actually acquire the silo itself. So how do you do that? You've seen a silo of grain. If you've ever been, go to a terminal area, they're enormous. There's no way. You're not moving it. You're not going to shake it. You're not going to jump, and it's not going to budge. So how are you going to do that? So there's a few ways to do it. One way to do it is to buy the actual silo. This is called kinyan agav. Kinyan agav, we'll learn about it in maybe a week or so, less than a week probably. Kinyan agav is by acquiring the property, you acquire the stuff that's in the property. This is what the pasuk says. Im ari b'tzuris b'Yehudah. So there was I don't remember exactly who said it. I'll have to look it up when we get there. But basically, there's these fields in Yehudah, and the father left them as an inheritance. I'm sorry, he left the valuables in the fields. So that's how Kinyan Agav works. So through the property, you acquire the stuff that's in the silo. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is through Kinyan Chalipin. Kinyan Chalipin is sort of, you take this useless shmata that's sort of this big, 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim, and you pick up the shmata, and by picking up the shmata, you acquire the stuff in the silo. That's called Kinyan Chalipin. We'll soon see, okay, maybe Chalipin doesn't work for commodities. So maybe it wouldn't actually work for grain in a silo. It's a more complicated thing. One of the ways you sell your chametz to the rabbi is probably through this. So the rabbi asks you to pick up a pen or maybe a small cloth that he has with him, and that is called kinyan chalipin. So the same thing works for an Evet Kanani. You have an Evet Kanani, and you want to sell him, so you could sell him with kinyan chalipin. The new master will pick up, or maybe he'll acquire his own freedom that way. I'm sorry, no. I'm sorry, no. The new master will pick up a pen. I'm sorry, the old master, the one who owns him right now, will pick up a pen or a piece of cloth, and by that he will be selling the slave to the new master. So that the Tanadi done. Okay, why does our mission not list chalipin? Milsa the lesser metatling tani. Our mission only lists things that don't work for metallic, for movable objects. Movable objects are not acquired with kesef. Why not? Anyone remember? Movable object, if you buy money is not an active acquisition. If you're buying anything in the grocery store, you can't buy it with money. The reason for this is so basically, we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Shlokish. I don't think it's in Kiddushin. I believe it's in. I think it's either in Bava Kama or Bava Tzia. I can't remember offhand. There's basically two methods that acquire the vast majority of metalpon. One of them is moving it, which is either Mashicha or Hagbal, lifting it or pushing it, depending on how heavy it is, and the other one is Kesef. There's a debate which one applies to it. One of these applies to a Jew, but not to a non-Jew. One of them applies to a non-Jew, but not to a Jew, biblically speaking. Rabbinically speaking, both apply to both categories. Both Kesef and Hagbal apply to a Jew and a non-Jew. However, Kesef does not work rabbinically. Why? Because we're concerned that it will be a fire in his house, and because the guy paid cash, right? The stuff is still in your silo. And obviously, you're not going to work on saving his stuff. You'll save your stuff first. And therefore, the rabbi said you have to move the item. So he actually has to take the stuff out of the silo first. And then, presumably, the rabbi said once he took it out of the silo, he'll probably take it home with him. Probably won't put it back in. And if he did, you'd probably have more of a relationship. You'd know is he a watchman? What type of watchman is he, etc. Okay. So therefore, our mission lists items that do not work for metaltlin, for movable objects. How milsa less of metaltlin tani, milsa eats of metaltlin like tani. But because chalipin works for metaltlin, that's why it's not listed in the Mishnah. Amar Shmuel, Evet Kedani nickname of Mashicha. And Evet Kedani could be acquired with Mashicha. So this is clearly a kinyan metaltlin that we just mentioned. Mashicha is moving something. Kate said, how does it work? Takfa, you grab him, and you pull him. Kana, if you do that, then you acquire him. However, let's say you call his name. You say, Mr. Slave, come over here. Karu ba'atzlei, like Kana, you don't acquire him. Okay, we'll explain this in a moment. Now, Bishlem Tani done, Milstisam Tatlik like Tani, the less Tatlik Tani. According to the previous brisa, because Mashicha works by metaltlin, that's why Mashicha is not listed in the Mishnah. Only things that don't work for metaltlin, movable objects, are listed in the Mishnah. Kesef, Shtar, and Chazaka, which do not work for metaltlin. So for example, if you buy a knife in the store and you use the knife, it's not a kinyan. Now, if you did Mashicha, presumably you had to do Mashicha with the knife, right? You were using the knife, you probably had to lift it up. But maybe you had in mind that you don't want to acquire it with Hagval, with lifting it up, or Mashicha moving it. In that case, the fact that you use it is not a kinyan. Mashicha is not a kinyan. I'm sorry, Chazaka, use of it is not a kinyan. Mashicha is a kinyan. So therefore, our Mishnah lists things, or shtar, these things don't work for metaltlin. But Mashicha and Chalipin do work for metaltlin, that's why they're not listed in the Mishnah. Al-Tana Bra, but according to the opinion that says that we don't list, that disagrees, that says that Chalipin is not listed in the Mishnah because Chalipin doesn't actually work. So if that's the case, why is Mashicha not listed? Tani Milsa the Isa Be Mekarkoi Be Metaltlin. Mashicha the Metaltlin Isa Mekarkoi less like Tani. 1 second. Okay. The reason why Mashicha is not okay. The reason why. 1 second. I'm sorry. According to the author, that includes Chalipin in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says 4 scenarios: Kesef, Shtar, Chazaka, and Chalipin. Our author of the Mishnah says that Chalipin is not in the Mishnah. Why? Because anything that has to do with metaltlin is not in the Mishnah. Movable objects. But there is an opinion that says Chalipin is in the Mishnah. So if that's the case, then if Chalipin is in the Mishnah, why is Mashicha not in the Mishnah? Why is Chalipin included and Mashicha is excluded? The answer is because Mashicha is something that does not apply to property. You cannot, obviously, right? You acquire property by moving it, right? You have to make or something. Take it. Like Tani. 1 second. One second. Okay. So that's why Mashiach is not listed. Okay. Now, so getting back to the how exactly do you do Mashiach on an Eved? How do you move him? Kate said, "Talk for your it's like Kana. You pull him and he comes to you. That's a kinyan. Karu it's like Kana. If you call him and he comes, that's not a kinyan." So the Gemara says, "Hold on. The Karu if you call him and he comes, it's not a kinyan." Vatanya we learned. Okay, so now the important thing here is when you acquire an animal, there's 2 ways to do it: Mashicha and Mesira. What's the difference? Mashicha is to get the animal to move. So how do you do that? You take a whip, you whip him and he runs, right? That's all you need. You got him to move. Mesira, on the other hand, is an action where the owner, the previous owner, hands the animal to you. So what would be an example of that? You have the halter, is that what it's called? He has the horse, the halter. So he grabs the this is that thing that you click onto the halter, I don't remember. The lead rope, the lead rope with the reins, and he hands it over to the other guy. Or anything else, basically. So in other words, that's sort of handing over the animal. The animal doesn't actually have to move. but that's how he would hand it over. Ketz Masira. Also, but tilfa, you grabbed it by the hoof. That would be, I guess, a smaller animal. But Sira with its hair, but Ukav Shala, that's the saddle. Bishlif Shala, the loads. The Prumish of Pia is the bit. Ubezug Shabbat Savara is the yoke. Kana. So, in other words, once you're given over sort of the controlling features, then you acquire it. That's called Masira. Okay, we'll get to Masira later. If you miss it now, that's fine. It's coming up in a couple of days. Ketzeb and Mashicha. How do you do Mashicha? That's the main subject. Kaira law, you call the animal, right? The dog's name is Bingo. You say, Bingo, come here, and it comes, right? The Hiba, and it comes. Or Shekisha b'makal. You hit it, and it runs. As soon as it moves the hand, the front and back legs, what they call the hand and the foot in Talmudical parlance, kana, it's a kinyan. In second, let's continue. Rav Asi Amar, Rav Acha Amar, Rav Asi says the animal has to move one animal's length, whichever type of animal it is, one length of itself, it has to move in order for Mashiach to work. Okay, so the question here is, Bingo come here is a kinyan. So how come if Johnny come here is not a kinyan? Why, when you're talking to an Eved, is it not a kinyan? When you're talking to a dog, it is a kinyan. So Amri behema da'at demara also. When you call an animal, you say bingo, the animal doesn't think, doesn't have a mind to think. It's not conscious. So therefore, when you call the animal, it's coming because you called it. Behema da'at demara also. It goes because of the master. Eved da'at nafsheka also. Johnny, he decides to listen to his master and come. Doesn't have to. Okay. And that's why to acquire the slave, you can't calling him is not enough. You have to schlep him. Amar Rashi says, Eved Koton, if you have a child who's a slave, kibehema, it's like an animal. In other words, a child has no mind of his own. And therefore, if you call him, that would be an act of machine. Tana Rabbana, the rabbis taught, Kate said b'chazaka, how do you acquire an Eved by chazaka? Chazaka is sort of use. It's very simple. You have to use him. Hit your lemon Allah. He untied your shoes. Or he carried your stuff to the bathhouse. If Shita, he unclothed him. Herchitza, he washed him. Sachai, he put oil on him. Girdai, I believe he scraped him. Helpisha, he put on his clothing. Hinila, he put on his shoes. Higbiyai, he lifted him up to carry him. Let's say the ground was dirty or something. Kanai, he acquired it. He acquires him. Rav Shimon says, "Leite chazaka gedola mehagbal." 1 second. Rav Shimon, leite chazaka gedola mehagbal. Shtahagbal kainem b'chol makom. So Rav Shimon says that besides for chazaka, meaning actual service, if he lifts up the master, then that should for sure work. Shtahagbal kainem b'chol makom, because hagbal works in every scenario. Now hagbal works the opposite. If the master picks up the slave, that would be hagbal. Not that the slave picks up the master. The Gemara asks, "My Kamar, what exactly does he mean?" Rashi says as follows: If the slave picks up the master acquires a slave. Why? Chazaka. He's using the slave. So, for example, the ground was very dirty. He came out of the bathhouse. He doesn't want his feet to be dirty, so the slave picks him up and carries him over to a bench to put on his clothing. Or the master was he was handicapped or something and he needed to be picked up. So that's a kinyan. However, Higbiya Rabbi, if the master picks up the slave, that's not a valid kinyan. Because Agbal does not work for a slave. Rav Shimon says, no, let the Chazaka Gedolim Agbal. Chazaka is not going to be a more common kinyan than Hagbal. Chazaka use is not going to be more powerful kinyan than hagbal lifting something up, and therefore, if the master lifts up the slave, that is a kinyan hagbal. If the slave lifts up the master, that's the kinyan. If that's the case, shifcha kanan is tikna b'biyah. A maidservant should be acquired, could be acquired with intercourse. Why is this? Because the intercourse is considered as if the woman picks up the husband. Picks up her master. Sorry, they're not married. as if she picked up her master because he would be on top of her. So the Gemara says, Ki kamrinan, what are we referring to? Zenen of Zemetzdar. The typical kinyan has to be, chazaka has to be where you're using the slave, meaning the slave is mitzvah, he's in pain. Over here, they're both deriving pleasure from this act. So the Gemara offers an alternative. If he has intercourse in an unusual fashion where it is painful for her, would that be considered an act of the maidservant picking up the master? First of all, he says, who says that if the intercourse is in an unusual manner, that would be entirely unpleasant for her? Maybe she would enjoy it. Who knows? And moreover, the Torah equates the normal manner with the unusual manner, and therefore, because the usual manner is not a kinyan, the unusual manner would also not be a kinyan as well. And it's not a method of acquiring a maidservant.
He's using her.
What?
He's using her in a way.
Yeah, with zanena of zanena. They're both deriving pleasure from the act. Okay. Rabbi Yehudah Handua, Ger she'en lo yarsh nava. There was this convert, he had no inheritors. Chola, she became ill. All Marzutra l'shilibe. Marzutra came to see what he needs. The main mitzvah is to see what the person needs. You go to a sick person's house. What do you do? You can talk to him. That's also helpful. It's also one of the things he needs probably. One of the things you could do is see if he actually needs anything. Like wash the dishes or something. Marzutra saw that this fellow, this convert, was literally about to die. He was hovering between death and life. He was about to die. He says to the slave of this convert, carry my shoe, and carry it to my house. So what's the idea here? Chazaka, right? He's doing a kinyan chazaka. When the slave dies, then all his servants are free. So what's Marzutra doing here? He doesn't want the slave to be free. She's saying, carry this. And what's going to happen is at the moment of death, the guy's going to be carrying Marzutra's shoe, which is the kinyan from Marzutra. So Marzutra would acquire the slave. Okay. Some say he was an adult. Yehudah Handua died, and Marzutra left, and he was alive, and he got the slave. And some say this slave was a katan, he was a child, and not like the opinion of Abishal. In other words, according to Abishal, there would be no need for Marzutra to play this game. But because Marzutra disagreed with Abishal, so he had to trick the kid into acquiring him. We'll explain. In time to be learned. Ger shemes, you have a convert that dies, and he has no inheritors, so therefore all the Jews can take his property. They were slaves, whether they were adults or children. They're all freed. Abishal says, if they were adults, if they were children, whoever engages them in labor acquires them. So now Marzutra did not hold like Abishal, because he held like the rabbis that the child slave would acquire himself. So he didn't want the child slave to acquire himself. So therefore, he gave him his shoe, so that at the moment of death he was actually in the service of Marzutra. Marzutra acquired him. According to Abishal, there would be no need, because according to Abishal, as soon as the guy dies, you could have just acquired the child afterwards. You don't have to do it before he dies, because according to Abishal, a child cannot acquire himself his own freedom. And okay, we together? No, not quite. Okay, more or less. Okay, the slave acquires himself with money. Okay, 1 second. This is an introduction to the next Gemara, which is quite difficult. So let's try to get this one. Let's get this one clear. So going here with the opinion of our mayor. Mayor says money through the slave, shtar, a document through other people. I'm sorry. Sorry, money through somebody else, a document through himself. So Gemara asks, money works through somebody else. If somebody else acquires a slave's freedom on his behalf, but he can't do it on his own. But my asking, what's the story here? If the story is that he doesn't know about it, so he's not consenting. Let's examine this. We know the opinion of Rameir is Rameir says that a slave typically does not want to be emancipated. He wants to stay as a maidservant, as a slave. In Tanya we learned, we learned that a person could acquire something for some. In other words, I can pick up a lost object for you. I can acquire things on your behalf things that you would actually want. The things that you wouldn't want, I cannot acquire on your behalf. But you can't provide him with an obligation with something that he doesn't want, unless he wants it, unless he consents and he's present. It must be when somebody else redeems a slave, it's with the slave's consent. And from here we see with consent, it's only permitted through somebody else, but he can't redeem himself. Why can't he redeem himself? We see from here, a slave cannot acquire money. Anything he acquires goes to his master. So it's not possible for him to redeem himself because it's not possible for him to have money to redeem himself because everything that he owns goes to the master. Okay, fine. So when we talk about redeeming money, we're talking about that he consents that somebody should redeem himself. 1 second, but if he consents, why can't somebody else also accept the document on his behalf? He acquires himself with the shtar. He is the one who can accept the shtar, but nobody else. But if he consents for the other person to receive the document on his behalf, why shouldn't somebody else be able to redeem? Why shouldn't somebody else be able to collect the document on his behalf? So maybe you'll suggest that when the Mishnah says that he can use the document, that he redeems himself with the document, that means he also could redeem himself with the document, but somebody else as well, not just himself. So afay means also him, meaning somebody else can redeem him with the document, both with money and with the document, if he consents. And he also could redeem himself with the document, even though he can't redeem himself by money. But when it comes to a document, he could redeem himself. And from here we see the gittin that his divorce and his ability to acquire the divorce come at once, and that's how he's able to receive his own divorce, his own emancipation. The Bryce doesn't say this. The Tanya we learned, Rameir says that when you redeem a slave with the document, you emancipate a slave with a document, it must be received by the slave himself and not by somebody else. The Rameir, it's the opinion of Rameir. So we have a little bit of a problem here. What exactly is Rameir talking about? Rameir says money, somebody else. A document, slave himself. What's the scenario? If the slave is consenting, so then we understand why money through somebody else works, but we don't understand why somebody else can't receive a document on his behalf. He consents. What's the problem? And if he doesn't consent, so I understand why he has to receive the document, but how could somebody else redeem him? He doesn't consent to be redeemed. We're talking about where he does not consent. So how could the other guy redeem him if he doesn't want to be redeemed? The shiny kesef money is different. because the slave has no right to, let's say the master sells a slave from one master sells a slave to another master. Does the slave have a right to consent? No. Slave can't consent not to be sold. So because money can acquire a slave without his consent, so therefore it can redeem him as well without his consent. Okay, there's just one problem with that. What's the problem with that? The same thing is true with documents, right? A document, one master buys a slave from another master with a document, is without the slave's consent. So why can't the slave be emancipated with the document against his will as well? What's the difference? In other words, you sold the slave to somebody else who did it with document or money. Either one works without consent of the slave. So when it comes time to emancipate him, why by money can it be done without consent, but by document you need consent? So Gemara says, it's two different types of documents. Document to sell one slave to another master is one type of document, and emancipation is a completely different document. Whereas money, the money is being given for different reasons. So Gemara says, no, it's the same money. The same money that buys a slave from one master to another master is the same money that redeems the slave, and therefore redemption of a slave could happen against as well. Rava here has a much sharper angle, in my opinion. Rava Amar, Kesef Kabbalas Rabbi Garmalai, Shtar Kabbalas Acherim Garmalai. This is the critical feature. How exactly is a slave emancipated by money? It's because his master received the money. Dependent on the master receiving the money. It's Kabbalas Rabbi Garmalai. It's the master receives the money. He's like, okay, I have money. I don't need the slave anymore. He's gone. He's free. However, by a document, how is he emancipated? Not because the master wants to emancipate, but because somebody wishes to receive the document. The guy who receives the document, he's the one that emancipates. And therefore, the money doesn't depend on the slave's consent, because it's not up to the slave, it's up to the master. The master determines that the slave is freed by receiving the money. Whereas the emancipation document, it's the opposite. What emancipates the slave? The fact that the slave received the document. He has to receive it. He has to agree to it, or somebody agrees to it with his consent. So therefore, it makes sense that money could redeem the slave without consent. But a document can only be received by the slave without consent. The slave, other does not have to consent to the document, right? You can just force the slave to receive the document. You just give it to him. Yeah. But if somebody else wants to receive it on his behalf, then you need to get the slave's consent. Okay. Okay, so now we've established that what's the Mishnah referring to? A scenario shaloi midaita, without the consent or knowledge of the slave. About halfway down. Line 23a and 2 dots. So now we get to the rabbi's opinion, which is very complicated. Stop here. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop here. Do I have a table for this Gemara? No. I'll see if I can find